Member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm incredibly proud to stand in this House to speak on my private member's bill, Bill C-325, the right to housing. I believe that having a home is a human right, that in a country as wealthy as Canada, no one should be without a safe place to live. It didn't take me long to grasp the magnitude of the housing crisis in my riding of North Island Powell River. Housing cases continue to come into our office, and they are growing. I've heard horrifying stories. For example, a single woman living in a van because she had been diagnosed with a significant health issue, which meant she had to choose between medication and a special diet over her home. A couple with a teenage boy with special needs living in a tent in their parents' backyard. A retired man of 70 couch surfing between several friends, a local business owner who hired a new employee and had to wait 8 months for them to start because they could simply not find housing. People calling the police and breaking the law until they are arrested because they are cold and have nowhere else to sleep. Bidding wars on rentals with people using over 65% of their income to pay the rent. Seniors waiting in acute care ready to go to a home, but there are no homes available. There is no doubt that the stories of North Island Powell River are the same as too many across Canada. Housing is a priority that must be advocated for loudly and boldly. I want to thank our NDP housing critic and MP for Hochelaga for working so hard. She's traveled across the country, and I know she understands the realities of people struggling every day for affordable, decent housing, whether in a large urban centre, rural areas, or Indigenous communities. She is there fighting. I am proud to be by her side to put this important piece of legislation forward. I'm not the first member in this House to bring this bill forward on the right to housing. There is a reason that the reiteration of this bill has survived all of these parliaments, through many members who believe that this is a right. I gather it rings true because it embraces the fundamental ingredient of our survival in finding shelter and our right to dignity. It is my hope that together we can pass this bill. It would be timely and key for the coming years while we start to reinvest in housing. Mr. Speaker, as a country, we are at a crossroads. We've lived through almost 30 years of inaction and budget cuts. In the last budgetary cycle, Liberals promised an abundance of cash. Months later, we still don't truly know how this money will be spent. I want to be very clear in this House. Whether it is in downtown Toronto, small cities, rural and remote communities, or Indigenous villages, there is no more time to be had. We are in a national housing crisis. People are desperate, and time has run out. C-325 aims to be the cornerstone for that long-term plan. This will ensure the foundation of a national housing strategy which can be built solidly and will stand the test of time. We can no longer just say housing is a right. It is time for it to be legislation. My bill will do this. It amends the Canadian Bill of Rights to introduce housing as a human right. In 1976, Canada enshrined the fundamental right to housing when the government of the day ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. However, this right has never been formally incorporated into Canadian law. This bill will make that happen. While working on this bill, a few of my constituents were concerned with this approach, thinking I wanted to give free houses to people. Although this would support so many people in moving towards their personal goals and safety, this is not what this bill does. Adding housing to the Bill of Rights means redefining the lens that housing is viewed through. It is about fundamental approach to reviewing regional differences, working with all levels of government and the market to address the reasons why we are facing such a housing crisis. And then building a national housing strategy grounded in the right to housing that will address it head-on. It's about creating a long-term solution. It is my hope that as a country, we never come to this place again. We must think differently about how we approach housing. What we need is a new lens, and C-325 offers that. Building a building here and there is not going to address the severity and systematic causes to our housing crisis. It is also important for me to say this. This housing crisis is again and again portrayed as a big city issue. This is simply not the reality. In a recent report from one of my communities with a population of 35,000, we have 47 unsheltered homeless, people literally sleeping outdoors, and 32 being reported sheltered homeless, sleeping in a shelter. This does not even address the concerns of overcrowded homes and the people who are couch surfing. This has led to the local municipality working hard to have accessible bathrooms. This is a serious result of having people without a home in your community. Mr. Speaker, I referenced dignity earlier in my speech. Human rights are that, moral principles. When our fellow citizens don't have a safe place to sleep, a place to go to the bathroom, these are incredibly dehumanizing experiences. A home is more than a physical space. Housing is intrinsic to the sense of security for families and stability needed to prevent marginalization. All of us look to home as an anchor in our community life, a retreat and a refuge. What happens to people when they don't have this is debilitating. The ramifications have been studied repeatedly, and the stress on our communities and society can attest to this. In Canada, it is estimated that more than 235,000 people are without a home during the year. Based on a joint study by the Canadian Observatory of Homelessness and the Canadians Alliance to End Homelessness in 2014, the gradual withdrawal of federal investment in social housing is one of the primary causes of this problem. Our society and governments are letting people down. Devoid of a comprehensive safety net, cracks are appearing at an alarming rate. Affordability is central, but cracks are appearing because of the results of not having a stable home. Mental health, addiction issues, illness due to stress, family breakdowns, and so much more. Mr. Speaker, I believe that all of us in this House have sat with constituents and heard heartbreaking stories. We are on the front lines of hearing where the human reality of legislation lives. I recently sat with a couple who shared their story of homelessness. It is a story that I hear all too often. One partner falls ill, they can no longer work, and the family loses their home because they cannot afford their mortgage. To add more weight to their reality, this couple has a son with a significant debility, one that leads to a child who expresses themselves through loud yelling when frustration grows. Finding a home that is not an apartment building where the noise upsets the neighbors is their priority. This is just one story, and it exemplifies the need for a different approach, a more holistic model to viewing housing. Imagine a housing plan that respects human rights. With the government consultations, the right to housing was a recurrent theme in many comments shared at the expert roundtable. Stakeholders clearly spelled out the need for the legally recognized right to housing. They insisted that a national housing strategy should examine whether our laws, policies, and practices are sufficient to prevent homelessness, forced evictions, and discrimination in accessing adequate housing. They agreed on a rights-based approach to housing and how the right to housing must be recognized and realized through laws and policies. It's inspiring to see Canadians like Leilani Farha, a UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing and Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty, take a leadership role internationally. She said this: crafting a human rights-based policy would include eliminating discrimination in housing programs, setting measurable goals and timelines to reduce poverty, and giving people the means to hold governments to account if their rights are violated. This accountability is so badly needed. Many First Nations community are living in appalling conditions, and homelessness continues to rise across this country. For First Nations people living on reserve, the National Household Survey shows that almost 40% of these homes need major repairs, and close to 35% are not suitable for the family size. In some Inuit communities, the proportion of housing not suited to family size exceeds 50%. I did several roundtables on housing in my riding. What I heard was clear. Municipalities are doing everything they can with their very limited resources. Community-based organizations are working together to do what they can to support the people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. People are desperate and ready to live anywhere to have a stable home. I also saw how exhausted they were. doing what they could and needing help. They need help now, today, if not sooner. Hope is in short supply, Mr. Speaker. The broad range of people experiencing the housing crisis is only growing. It is alarming to talk to couples both working good jobs who cannot find a home they can afford to rent, let alone buy. There is a deep sense of betrayal because they have done everything right, worked hard to get where they are, and now they are hopeless. I've spoken with parents who have lost their children to care because they were evicted due to renovations and could not find appropriate housing. They can get their children back once they have a home to go to, but they simply cannot find one. Seniors renting out extra rooms in their homes. One I spoke to even renting out her living room because there is no other way she can afford to live. These are just a few of the many stories that are happening in all of our ridings. I want to say a special thanks to the Right to Housing Coalition for their hard work and continued work advocating for these rights. Housing is and always will be a top priority for New Democrats. We want the federal government to recognize the historically vital role of government in housing. The Government of Canada has a responsibility to take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this fundamental right by meeting the security, affordability, health, and safety needs of all Canadians. The government has a duty to ensure that all its citizens have access to suitable housing so that they can participate fully in society as it is their right. We seek action where the federal government returns meaningfully to the table on housing policy, committing to housing as a basic human right. We want the framework of any solution to be based in the legislated right to housing. Mr. Speaker, it is my hope that today the members will speak in support of Bill C-325. It is time to give hope to those who desperately need and deserve it. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Thank you. It's always a good day to be in the House and talking about housing, and in particular to be talking about what this government has done on historic levels in terms of its investment, not just in the last year's budget, but in the previous years as well. As the House knows, we not only doubled the money upon taking office in 2015 and 2016, but also in last year's budget have now put on the table a 10-year program, the longest proposal ever put on record in the House of Commons, with the most money ever invested. Not only $11.2 billion over the next 10 years, but $10.9 billion in below-market loans and below-interest mortgage rates, as well as almost $5 billion in Aboriginal housing. My question to the member opposite is, she talks about the right to housing, a legal process that will find people talking to lawyers instead of landlords. My question to the party opposite is, if housing is as critical an issue as they suggest it is, and is the fundamental need for a national housing strategy so important to this country and for those seeking better housing, safe housing, and affordable housing, my question to the member opposite is very simple. Why did they vote against that budget?
For North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, all I can say to the member opposite through you is how sad I am to hear that it sounds like they won't be supporting the essential human right to housing. And that he can talk about the campaign promises, he can talk about money that is going to be out there someday. But right now, people are homeless, they are looking for homes, they are struggling in profound ways that we cannot imagine. The right to housing is a human right, and it is shameful that this government does not support that.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for bringing awareness to this really important issue. As a person that was on the board of a homeless shelter in my riding, and ever so aware of the needs that we have, I'm concerned that a law is good, but without the money to back it, you know, it's not really going to be very effective. As she's pointed out, the need is immediate, and in my own riding, I know that we're $40 million short to even, you know, maintain the existing affordable housing we have, which is woefully inadequate, and we have shelters as well. So I wondered if she could explain what the circumstances are in her own riding, so we might get an idea of what the amount of money the government would need to put in to fix this.
Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. You know, the reality in my riding is there's a community in my riding named Powell River where there is no shelter. So during the times when shelters are desperately needed, they actually have to put people on a ferry and send them to a community an hour and a half away, hoping that there will be space available in their shelter. Community I represent in Port Hardy, 4,000 people having a significant housing crisis where they can't find homes for people, and recently had a building burned down, an apartment building, and now are desperately looking for affordable housing for those people. The reality is a right to housing will look at having a framework of a national housing strategy. They have to work hand in hand. And we heard very clearly from all the consultations that this government did that the right to housing is the fundamental framework if we want to move forward for long-term solutions that will create a difference in the future. This is the only way forward, and I am very disappointed to hear that we will not be moving in that direction.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. Honorable député d'Hochelaga.
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased that my colleague has presented this bill. Not so long ago, she sent a written question to the government asking why Canada had never officially integrated the International Covenant on Housing. The response of the government was, among other things, the government currently fulfills its obligation to ensure right to adequate housing as stipulated under international law. I would ask my colleague if she agrees with that answer.
Honourable member for North Island Powell River in 45 seconds or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her very important question. And I disagree. You know, when we listen to people who've been working in housing, when we make international commitments, as a government, I would hope that they would not be afraid to take the next step and make that legislation. It's easy to say something. It is much harder to bring it into legislation, create a framework that really looks at the issue and provides long-term solutions. I ask this government to be less afraid, to take that step and make sure that no one in this country ever is without a home again, because we have a right to housing in our Bill of Rights.